Welcome back to We Do the Heavy Lifting. I'm your host, Dr. Jenny Yentis, and today we do heat mitigation. What in the world is heat mitigation? We all know what heat is, but how do you mitigate it? What even does that word mean? So for our listeners out there, hold on to your hats because we're going to learn all about it. And I'm really excited to introduce our guest today. I know I say that every week that I'm excited, but today I'm particularly excited. Our guest today is Dr. Benjamin. Dr. Courtney Benjamin is an assistant professor at Samford University, and that's in Alabama. And she has worked with various athletes to address changes in performance due to heat. Her research interests are focused around heat and hydration. And today we are going to be talking all about those things. So thank you for being here today.
Yeah, I'm super excited. Thank you guys for having me.
I'm just as excited. So let's start with something simple for our listeners. How does the body react to heavy training or exercise or, weekend warrior type kinds of things in the heat?
Great question. To start with, when we exercise, our body produces heat. We call that metabolic heat production, whether we're in a cool environment or a hot environment. The question then becomes, where does all of that heat go? Mm-hmm. And that's where thermal physiology and a lot of environmental researchers start to really get into the mechanisms behind this idea. And so when we exercise, our bodies are producing heat. We got to figure out, how do we get rid of it? The main way that our body dissipates heat is through evaporation of sweat. So there are a few other ways that we can either lose or gain heat, but our primary way to get rid of heat is through sweating, which is why when we exercise, we start to produce sweat. And the key there is it's actually not the sweat itself necessarily that cools our internal body temperature, but it's actually the act of the sweat that's on the skin evaporating into the environment that takes heat with it. And so this is why when you're exercising in a hot and humid environment, you tend to feel hotter and more miserable because your body is not as effective at losing heat. The reason for that is when we're in a hot and humid environment, the humidity makes it much more difficult for that sweat that's on our skin to evaporate into the environment, which means we're not taking away heat from our body as efficiently as we would be if we were in similar ambient temperature, but in a dry condition. In a dry environment, our sweat is able to work a little bit more effectively for us. So that, in a nutshell, is how we thermoregulate when we exercise.
I guess this is why they say shivering is good for you when you're in the cold, because your body produces heat then from that movement.
Exactly.
So it's kind of that same idea, but you're in a hot environment already and you're creating more heat.
Exactly. And sweating is the opposite essentially of shivering. Our body is getting a signal from our brain and specifically the hypothalamus, sends signals to our skin that also sends signals to our sweat glands to start producing sweat, and that continues to happen throughout when we exercise.
We know something about that here in Texas.
Absolutely, especially this past couple of weeks. It couldn't have been a better time to talk about heat down here.
Absolutely. Whenever this podcast airs, we are in the middle of a heat wave here in Texas, and you're probably like, well, that's just summer in Texas. No, it is extremely hot these days. And I know that I'm wearing a sweater at the moment, but every time you come indoors, the air conditioning, so you're going through all these crazy things. So what are other ways that we have indicators that a person's becoming too hot? Like, a lot of people understand, you can get heat injury. You can have heat stroke or these varying levels of a heat injury. What are these indicators? I mean, we sweat. Some people sweat more than others, but is there any other way for us to know we're getting too hot?
It's a good question. A lot of it is really based on the person's symptoms. So I'll start with the most extreme and then kind of work our way back. Exertional heat stroke is the very, very serious heat illness that can occur. Exertional heat illness specifically is what occurs in a lot of athletic populations. And it's essentially a condition that there's basically two diagnostic criteria that athletic trainers, sports medicine professionals use to diagnose whether or not someone's having an exertional heat stroke. One of those is central nervous system dysfunction. And so and that can look a lot of different ways for different people. It can be anything from someone collapsing on the field, passing out, all the way to someone kind of acting and looking like they're drunk, just completely all over the place, very lucid, not able to communicate very clearly, all and anything in between really can look like CNS dysfunction. So that's one. The problem with
for our listeners, CNS is central nervous system.
Central nervous system, yes.
Right.
Central nervous system, exactly. The problem with just saying central nervous system dysfunction is and using that to diagnose exertional heat stroke, is there a lot of other very serious conditions that are also CNS. They also have CNS dysfunction. For example, one that's also common that I've studied throughout my graduate work is hyponatremia, where you're consuming too much fluid or you don't have the appropriate amount of sodium intake. That can also present itself with central nervous system dysfunction. And so when you have an exertional heat stroke, you have to diagnose it in another way besides just looking at the CNS dysfunction. And the gold standard way to do that is with an internal body temperature assessment. There's 3 valid ways to assess internal body temperature. One is with an esophageal probe, which sounds as bad as it is, as bad as it sounds.
So you have to like swallow it, and
it goes up the nose, down the throat. Yes, it's a very lengthy thing, which is not doable, right? For people, especially when they're actually if someone has CNS dysfunction, you can't put an esophageal thermometer. No. It's not going to work. So what medical professionals use, what athletic trainers use, and what's in their best practices is a rectal thermometer. Again, it can be obviously controversial with a lot of people. However, I always teach to my students, I like to compare it to if I'm in cardiac arrest, I would hope that any one of my students, including the guys, would take off my clothing and put an AED on me, even though that's quite uncomfortable. We know that with exertional heat stroke, if it's diagnosed in a timely manner and treated appropriately, it's survivable. People will survive. I've seen people through my work at the Corey Stringer Institute go home from a race after having an exertional heat stroke and be totally fine if it's treated appropriately. So rectal temperature is the second way. And then the third is with an ingestible thermistor. We use that quite a bit in field research. It's a little pill, Bluetooth pill, that the person takes a couple hours before exercise, and it links up with a receiver, and you can measure internal body temperature from that. Obviously, the issue with that is you have to take the pill before you start the exercise, which they're $60 a piece, $65 a piece. Not everyone's going to do that for every single workout that they do. So
either that or somebody's going looking for it later.
Exactly. So from a medical standpoint, those are the 2 things that athletic trainers, sports medicine professionals can look for, is that CNS dysfunction and rectal temperature above 104.5-ish degrees is how you would diagnose an exertional heat stroke. So that's just one. And we could talk a lot more about many, many others. But I would say in general, if you're feeling lightheaded, nauseous, just not feeling well, you can expect that you're probably either dehydrated or getting a little bit too hot. Those are some of the main ones. One that's not true, and I like to always kind of debunk this myth. A lot of people say, if you're having an exertional heat stroke, you are going to have no sweat. You're going to stop sweating and your skin's going to be very hot and dry. Completely false. You can totally be having an exertional heat stroke and still be profusely sweating.
So there's no thing as you can sweat too much. That's not probably true either.
No. I mean, you definitely, the more you sweat, the more you need to focus on rehydrating. So that's a big key point to take away from sweating. And that's actually an adaptation. As humans, we start to sweat more when we become adapted to the heat. Heat acclimation or heat acclimatization is what we call it. When you're outside more, you're going to notice that you start producing more sweat, which is a great thing, right? Because as we just talked about, the more you sweat and the sweat can evaporate into the environment, the cooler your internal body temperature is going to be. The key to that is you also have to replace that fluid that you're losing.
Yeah.
So if you're sweating and you're not replacing the fluid, even if you're sweating more because you're adapted, it's not going to help you lower your internal body temperature.
I gotcha. So you've kind of given in some generalizations. So I'm guessing hot environments affect different individuals differently. I mean, it's not one size fits all. And something that came up I remember it being a pretty big topic last summer, was how skin pigmentation can affect heat absorption. You want to speak on that, or can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah,
for our listeners?
Sure. I think definitely there has not been an extensive amount of research from a thermoregulation standpoint. There has been several, I've seen publications come out about people, especially with like sunburn and vitamin D absorption and things like that related to skin pigmentation, excuse me. But as far as thermoregulation goes, there are really several other factors that we know contribute to internal body temperature changes far more than skin pigmentation. Okay. And so some of those include things like big picture aerobic fitness. If you're more aerobically fit, you're going to thermoregulate better than less aerobically fit.
Can you explain to our listeners what aerobic fitness? Some may know, but not really. What is that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's your ability to do endurance exercise. I mean, that's the easiest way to think about it. The ability to do a repeated bout of exercise for an extensive period of time. So think going on a run for 20, 30 minutes. If you can do that pretty well, you're going to be much better off at thermoregulating than if you couldn't run at all, or you could only run for 5 minutes. So the more aerobically trained you are, the better you are at thermoregulating. And again, these are just factors that we've known for a while can contribute to thermoregulation more so than something like skin pigmentation. So we focus more on those factors that make a huge difference, right? Another factor is hydration. Again, because we're losing so much sweat, because we're trying to cool off, if we're not hydrated, there's actually some research that shows if you are starting off an exercise or even just going outside and you're not hydrated well, you're actually going to produce less sweat, which again is not good. We want to be able to sweat. We want to be able to lose the heat. So being and maintaining a good hydration status is not good just from a thirst and perceptual standpoint, but it also helps to give our body the fluid that it needs to sweat to take heat away from it. So those are a couple of factors. Things like exercise intensity is another one. How if the person's having to work extremely hard in the workout, they're going to be producing more metabolic heat, which is going to put a lot more stress on the body to get rid of that excess heat. So those are just a couple of the factors, that go into thermoregulation.
So you kind of mentioned a few things that people can do to begin to have better performance in the heat. So what are the things besides, staying hydrated? And like you said, you can intake too much water or have too little sodium. So that's something you have to watch. But what are some of those things when, just drinking water isn't enough? Like how, out here in Texas, I've noticed even for me, like doing yard work sometimes, even if I try to do it early in the morning, it's still 80, 90 degrees and, you're getting hot pretty quick. So what are some of those other strategies besides just drinking water do you offer to athletes or just general individuals working in the heat?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the first and the one, again, that I am probably a little biased to because I did a lot of my dissertation work in this area, it's just getting acclimated to the heat. I think people don't take into account how efficient our human bodies were designed to get rid of or adapt to an environment that we place ourselves in. So as you notice a heat wave coming, or as you notice that the environment's getting warmer and warmer, you may want to back down on the amount of time or the volume of training that you may be doing at the very beginning so that you give your body some time to adapt to that environment that you're in. in general, you can expect most of the adaptations that you want to see to that activity take place anywhere from 7 to 14 days being exposed to that environment. So if you're just a little bit more cognizant of, I know this first week I'm not used to this environment, maybe I should ease myself into it a little bit. That's going to help tremendously, because you do see a lot of those great adaptations, like increasing your sweat rate. Your heart rate is going to be lower at a given activity intensity. Your internal body temperature is going to be lower. All of that is going to take place in a relatively short amount of time. So absolutely just adapting to the heat and easing into what you're doing is going to be a very big deal. From the athletic side, we know that a lot of the heat illnesses that occur are really common to occur on the first 2 days of athletes coming back to a sporting event or a sporting activity. And so if we can keep talking about, let's ease them in, let's get them acclimated to this adaptation or to this exercise, that we're going to reduce a lot of those heat illnesses that we see.
And Dr. Benjamin presented earlier to a group of us, and she had even shown heat illnesses in, your data was from the Air Force, correct?
Correct.
So it's something that we're seeing in all sorts of other occupations and tactical athletes.
Absolutely. Heat illness is, I think, something, unfortunately, that's here to stay, and it's becoming increasingly popular, unfortunately, not just in athletic settings, but also, you just mentioned the military. They are outside doing training a lot. I've talked in my talk earlier too. My husband was in the Marine Corps. He did boot camp at Paris Island, so he tells me all about how hot it was when he went through boot camp. So definitely for the military, but even tactical populations like police, firefighters, even workforce, various workforce populations like construction workers, road workers, garbage men and women. All of those populations that you see on a day-to-day basis that are exposed to the heat can be affected by heat illness. So there's, I give a little plug for a publication one of my colleagues just put together. Got to be part of it. Maggie Morrissey is her name. She invited me to be on this publication that was basically gathering a lot of experts in thermal physiology, as well as people who actually work in with these different populations. And we tried to publish some ideas of guidelines that could go into place to help prevent some of these illnesses and, unfortunately, deaths. Because as shocking as it may be to a lot of people die every single year. Just in the state of Texas, multiple people die every single year from heat illness. And it's really unfortunate, and it's something that myself and I know a lot of my colleagues are continuing to try to work on to prevent, because we know that there are a lot of strategies that can be implemented that will help to prevent some of those things from occurring.
Well, like you said earlier, like, it's not going away. The data have shown that, our climates are changing. We're getting hotter and hotter. Our summers are getting hotter. Our winters are getting colder. And we're starting to lose our spring and falls as the climates are changing. And so it's definitely something that, for people that haven't thought about it in the past, to start becoming a bit more aware of it. And you're not in a climate where you think about those types of things, you could be one day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And related to that, and sort of going back to what you asked me before, heat acclimation or acclimatization is one strategy that can be used. I think it's probably a really advantageous one. However, there are others as well, including hydration. One that I think a lot of people maybe take for granted, or they just don't think about too much, is different cooling modalities. And so there's some good research out now that demonstrates some pretty decent thermal physiology regulation with cooling towels, the use of fans. I mean, just the use of fans, even if you're out in the heat, can help with removing some of that excess heat that you're producing. I mentioned in the talk I did earlier, a study where we looked at dousing with ice water. So just spraying ice water, a ton of ice water, on yourself, on your face, on your head, on your body while you're working out in the heat, that could potentially aid in that, in some of that heat illness and some of that heat, especially perceptually, that you start to see.
Yeah. As a dog lover, I have to also plug thinking about our animals out in the heat. And I know that the dousing of ice water, as much as our dogs hate it, sometimes they're like, after a while, they're like, oh, that was great.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
In the act of it, they're like, no. And then they're like, oh, wait, this feels good.
Absolutely. I tell a lot of my students, I think it's an easy way to think about thermoregulation actually is with dogs. They don't really produce a lot of sweat like we do. I mean, they don't produce sweat. So they have a very difficult time getting rid of excess heat. And one of the primary ways they do that is through panting, which is why when you throw a ball to them, even now it's so hot in Texas, you just walk outside and they immediately start panting.
Yes.
And that's how they have to get rid of heat. So we have a great ability as humans to be able to sweat. And that's what allows us to be able to go out and do work and exercise in this heat like we do, because we have that capability of sweating and dissipating heat in that way that a lot of other animals don't have.
And for our female listeners, a lot of times I hear, oh, I sweat like a man. That's not a bad thing.
Absolutely.
In this thing, you're embrace it. Love it, because you're ahead of others when you're sweating that much.
Absolutely. I've heard the same thing from a lot of athletes that I work with. I don't want to sweat so much. I sweat more than this football player does. And I'm like, that's a great thing. Yeah. That's you're cooling your body. That's how you're able to work out as hard as you're working out, or run as much as you're running, is because you're cooling your body that effectively.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin, for being here and talking to us. And we always ask our listeners, is there anything you want to leave our listeners with? Any last key points you'd like to leave with them?
Stay hydrated, adapt to the heat, stay cool, but have fun. Have fun out in the heat. We got to have fun in the summer.
Oh, I know. Absolutely. What would life be if you were stuck indoors all summer long?
Exactly.
Oh, it'd be awful. Well, thank you again for being here. And thank you to our listeners for joining us for another episode of We Do the Heavy Lifting. And as always, if there's a topic you want to hear about or a guest speaker you'd like to hear from, please give us an email at huffinesinstitute@tamu.edu. And until next time, stay healthy. That's it.
That was fun.
Yeah.